The snow didn't crunch. It whispered. Serene moved with it, a grey shadow against the white, the rabbit snare cold in her raw-knuckled hands. 8 years she'd been a ghost. 8 years of silence, her voice locked tight as a winter-frozen river. Silence was survival. Silence was freedom. Then a horn call split the icy air. Low, resonant, shaking the pine needles, the Alpha King's hunt. She didn't breathe. She just melted back into the ironwood trees, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. He was here, the wolf with a crown, the man bound by laws older than the mountains, and she was the one secret this frozen land held. Serene's silence was a fortress. It had begun the winter she turned 16, the winter she saw Anya, the baker's daughter, dragged from her home. Anya had a voice like warm honey, and the Alpha of the Fell clan had heard it. He'd claimed her. The word was a violation, a binding of magic and will that left no room for the girl herself. Anya's eyes, when they'd taken her, had been hollow. Serene went to the river that night, looked at her own reflection in the black, icy water, and swallowed her voice. She locked it in a box deep inside her chest and threw away the key. Now 8 years later, she was 24. She was Silent Serene, the village ghost, a phantom who mended nets, reset traps, and gathered herbs, leaving them on doorsteps in exchange for flour or lard. They pitied her. They were grateful for her. They feared her just a little. Her stillness was unnatural. They mistook her discipline for damage. It was the perfect armor. She lived in a small stone and turf hut at the very edge of the village, where the forest began to claw its way back. It was small, but it was hers. Tonight the wind was a wolf howling at her door. She sat by her meager fire, sharpening her skinning knife, the rhythm the only sound. Scrape, scrape, scrape. Her traps had yielded 3 rabbits. Enough to trade for oil, maybe some salt. She was checking the last snare, her breath puffing in the twilight when the king's party arrived. They were not hunters, she realized. They were warriors. They wore no colors, only black fur cloaks and boiled leather armor that was scarred and dark. They rode massive dark-coated horses that breathed steam like dragons. And at their head, him, the Alpha King, Magnus. Serene had only seen him in tapestries, a myth of iron and shadow. The reality was more terrifying. He was huge, even in the saddle, broad-shouldered and radiating a dense, coiled stillness. His cloak was the pelt of a shadow wolf, its head forming a hood that obscured his face, save for the glint of his eyes. They didn't ask for lodging. They took it. The village headman, bowing so low his forehead nearly touched the snow, offered the great hall. The warriors dismounted, their movements economical and dangerous. Serene slipped back into the trees, her heart a cold stone. She moved along the wood line, a path only she knew, and came around to the back of the hall. She just needed to get to the smokehouse, drop her rabbits and disappear back to her hut. She slipped through the alley, head down. The voice was not loud, but it stopped her cold. It was like gravel and thunder. A warrior, tall and scarred, blocked her path. He was not the king. This one's eyes were a flat, pale grey. He looked her up and down, his gaze lingering. "The hall," he motioned. "The king requires servants. You will work." Serene stared at him, her expression blank, and gave a small, jerky shake of her head. She pointed to her throat, then crossed her hands in front of her. The village sign for broken, mute. The man's lip curled. He was Kale, the king's general. Mute? He stepped closer. Or just defiant? She flinched but held her ground. She could smell the cold iron of his mail, the faint copper of old blood. Kyle, the king's voice. It wasn't a command. It was a statement. He had dismounted and was standing not 10 feet away. He pushed back his wolf-pelt hood. Serene's breath caught. This was no tapestry. His face was hard-planed, angular, brutal in its beauty. His hair was black as a raven's wing, tied back from his temples. But his eyes, they were a strange pale gold, luminous in the dusk. They held an ancient, weary intelligence. He was not looking at Kale. He was looking at her. She looked down, her hood shadowing her face, her body rigid with terror. He took a step. The snow compressed under his boot. He was assessing her, the torn hem of her tunic, the rabbit blood on her hands, the knife at her belt. He was seeing her, really seeing her, in a way no one had in 8 years. He was listening. Serene could feel it. He wasn't just looking. He was listening. For a heartbeat, for a breath, for the whisper of a soul. It was a pressure she felt on her skin, a low vibration in the air. This was the Alpha's sense, the one that hunted for the true song. She gave him nothing. She was a stone. She was the ice. She was a hollow, empty thing. After a silence that stretched for an eternity, his gaze moved on. The pressure vanished. He turned to Cale. "Leave her. She's of no use." He walked past her into the great hall, the shadow of his cloak brushing her. Serene stayed frozen, the imprint of his presence burning on her skin. She had been seen by the wolf, and he had found her empty. She exhaled a ragged, soundless gasp. She was safe. She ran, disappearing into the falling snow as the lights of the great hall flared behind her. She did not see the king pause just inside the doorway, his golden eyes fixed on the empty space where she had been. The blizzard hit an hour later. It wasn't a storm. It was a siege. The wind screamed, and the snow came down not in flakes but in suffocating walls of white. The world shrank to the inside of her hut. For 2 days Serene was safe. She rationed her food, mended her cloak, and waited. The quiet was a comfort, her silence a familiar blanket. On the 3rd day the food ran out. Her stomach ached, but it was the cold that was worse. Her firewood was dwindling to kindling. The blizzard had not lessened. It had intensified. If she didn't get more wood, she would freeze. The only place with a full-seasoned woodshed was the great hall. She bundled herself in every layer she owned, her face wrapped in a wool scarf until only her eyes showed. She stepped into the whiteout. It was like walking into a roaring mouth. She fought her way through the drifts, clinging to the walls of huts, a ghost in the gale. She reached the hall's woodshed, her limbs numb. She gathered an armload, her movements desperate, and turned to leave. The shed door slammed open. Cale, the general, stood there. "I thought I'd find a rat skulking," he sneered. "Thieving from the king." Serene dropped the wood, her hands flying up to sign no, cold, useless gestures. He grabbed her arm, his grip a band of iron. "The hall is freezing. The servants are useless. You'll work." He dragged her from the shed and through a side door, pulling her into the suffocating heat and noise of the great hall. It was packed. Warriors were everywhere, their damp furs steaming, the air thick with the smell of wet wool, sweat, and roasting meat. They were loud, their voices bouncing off the rafters. At the far end, on the headman's raised dais, sat the king. Cale shoved her toward the massive hearth. "Stoke it." "Keep it fed." Serene stumbled, catching herself. She was trapped. She kept her head down, her scarf still high on her face, and moved to the wood box. She began to feed logs into the fire, her movements small, precise, invisible. She could feel him watching. She didn't look. She knew, the way the air on the back of her neck prickled, the way the noise of the hall seemed to dip around a single point of silence. Magnus wasn't joining the revelry. He sat in the great chair, a mug of untouched ale before him, staring into the flames. His golden eyes were hypnotic, reflecting the dance of the fire. He was separate from his men, an island of absolute authority. She worked. She brought wood. She cleared tankards, her eyes on the floor. She was a shadow, but the shadow was tethered to the man by the fire. Hours passed. The storm howled. The men grew drunker. One of them, a brute with a braided beard, grabbed her wrist as she passed. "Here now, little mouse," he slurred, yanking her close. "You're a quiet one. I like that." Serene froze, her body rigid. "Leave her," Kyle's voice cut through. "She's just a village mute." "General," the man laughed. "She is under the king's protection," Kyle said, his voice flat. The warrior's eyes widened, and he released her instantly as if she'd burned him. "My apologies." Serene scurried back to the hearth, her heart hammering. "Under the king's protection?" She risked a glance at Magnus. He was looking right at her. There was no kindness in his gaze. It was raw, possessive, and deeply curious. He was a man studying a puzzle he couldn't solve. Why had he protected her? To own her. She had a small secret pocket sewn into the lining of her tunic. In it she kept her only treasure, a small bird carved from a piece of ironwood, its wings spread. Her father had made it for her before he died. It was the last piece of her old life, the life with a voice. Her hand trembled. She reached into the pocket, her fingers brushing the smooth wood. A simple grounding touch. As she pulled another log, her hand snagged on a splinter. The small bird was jolted from her loose grip, falling from her pocket and skittering across the stone floor. It rolled to a stop directly at the king's boot. Serene's blood turned to ice. She stared at the bird. To retrieve it, she would have to approach him, to speak to him in a way. He leaned down, his movements fluid as a panther's, and picked it up. He didn't look at her. He held the small wooden bird in his massive, calloused palm. He turned it over, studying the knife marks, the simple, loving detail. A muscle worked in his jaw. He looked at her. He held her gaze. He closed his fist around the bird, and he slipped it into his own tunic. He had taken it. Serene felt a sudden sharp spike of anger, so pure and hot it almost made her dizzy. It was hers. She took a step toward him, her hands clenched. Her eyes for the first time met his without flinching. They were defiant. A slow, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his mouth. It was not a smile of humor. It was a smile of discovery. He had found a crack in her fortress. He had found her, and he was still holding her bird, a hostage against her silence. The tension in the hall was a taut wire. Serene's anger warred with her terror. He knew. He didn't know her secret, not yet, but he knew her silence was a lie. Her defiant glare had told him. He was toying with her, this predator king, and she had just given him a weapon. She wanted to scream. She wanted to snatch the bird from him and run. Instead, she dipped her head, a gesture of submission she did not feel, and retreated to the shadows of the hearth. But she watched him. He kept his hand over his heart where he had tucked her carving. He was guarding it. Or perhaps he was. Feeling it, the storm raged for another day. The hall became a prison. Serene worked, her senses stretched thin. She was aware of every time Magnus moved, every time his gaze swept the room and settled on her. He had not spoken to her again. He had not needed to. The line was drawn between them, invisible and unbreakable. On the fifth morning, the wind died. A sudden, startling quiet fell over the village. The blizzard was over. The warriors stirred, restless, eager to be gone. Kale was barking orders, preparing the horses. They would leave within the hour. Serene felt a surge of desperate relief. She would endure this last hour, and then he would be gone. He would take her carved bird, but he would leave her life. A fair trade. She had one last duty. The side door was blocked by a mountain of snow. Kale ordered her to help clear it. She was outside, the air sharp and clean in her lungs, the new snow blindingly white. She shoveled her back to the hall. She heard a small sound behind her. A sniffle. Petter, the innkeeper's son, a small boy of 4, had toddled out after her unnoticed. He was fascinated by the warriors and by her. He often followed her, a silent shadow for her silent one. "Go back," Serene mouthed. Her expression fierce, gesturing to the hall. He giggled, a puff of steam, and hid behind a massive, stacked log pile. "Mute, girl!" Kyle shouted from the doorway. "More ale for the men, now!" Serene nodded, her shoulders tight. She turned to go, casting one last warning glance at the log pile. Petter was hidden. She walked back toward the door. As she passed Kyle, he grabbed her shoulder, spinning her. His face was close, his pale eyes full of suspicion. "You are a liar," he hissed, his voice low so the king couldn't hear. "I see it. You are no mute. You are a spy. A witch, perhaps." "Hiding your curses," Serene's eyes widened. She tried to pull away. "You will speak for me," he growled, his grip tightening, his fingers bruising her. "Or I will make you." He drew a long, thin dagger from his belt. A little cut, a little pain. That often loosens the tongue. He pressed the flat of the cold blade against her throat. Serene was paralyzed. This was it. This was the end. She could feel the sharp edge just break the skin. A blur of black fur and white teeth exploded from the hall. It was not Magnus. It was his wolf. A massive shadow-black beast, larger than any wolf she had ever seen. It slammed into Kale, sending him flying into a snowdrift. The dagger spun away. The wolf stood over Kyle, a growl tearing from its chest that was the sound of an avalanche. Kyle scrambled, his face pale, his bravado gone. "My king, The wolf did not move. And then it changed. The sound of shifting bones, the shimmer in the air. The wolf was gone, and Magnus stood in its place, bare-chested in the snow, his human form radiating a terrifying primal heat. His golden eyes were not human. They were pure molten rage. He did not look at Kyle, he looked at Serene, at the thin line of blood on her throat. "You," he snarled. At that exact moment, Petter, startled by the wolf's growl, stumbled out from his hiding place. He tripped and fell. His small weight against the base of the log pile was just enough. The stacked wood groaned. The top log, a massive piece of frozen oak, shifted. It began to roll. It was rolling directly toward the small boy who sat frozen on the ground. Magnus saw it. He was too far. Kale was too far. Serene was closest. She didn't think. She didn't plan. She didn't remember her vow. She acted. She launched herself forward, covering the boy's body with her own, curling around him as the shadow of the log fell over them, and she screamed. It was not a scream of terror. It was a roar of pure protective rage. No! The word ripped from her throat, raw from 8 years of disuse, scraping and hoarse. But it was a word. It was her voice. It shattered the morning quiet. The rolling log hit a knot in the wood below and stopped inches from her back. Petter was crying beneath her, but Serene was frozen. She had done it. She had spoken. Absolute silence fell. Kale stared, his mouth open. The warriors in the doorway were statues. Serene slowly pushed herself up. She looked at Magnus. He hadn't moved. His golden eyes were fixed on her, the wolf rage gone, replaced by something far more devastating. Shock, recognition, a profound, soul-shattering awe, the lex prima, the first law. He had heard it, the sound that his alpha blood had been listening for his entire life. Not a song, not a whisper of magic. Just one raw, defiant word from a girl who should have been silent. His world and hers had just ended. The silence that followed her voice was heavier than the snow. It was a weighted blanket, suffocating. Serene's heart was a captured bird, beating against the cage of her ribs, so loud she was sure he could hear it. Magnus took a step, then another. He walked past the crying child, past his stunned general. He stopped just before her, the steam rising from his bare shoulders. He looked down at her, this king who was more wolf than man. The molten gold of his eyes was terrifying, not with anger, but with a sudden devastating clarity. He saw her, not the mute, not the ghost, her. You, he whispered. The word was an accusation, a discovery, and a sentence all in one. Serene scrambled backward, crab-walking through the snow, her throat burning. The sound of her own voice echoed in her ears, a betrayal. The law, Kale stammered, picking himself up. My king, it is her. Magnus didn't look at him. His gaze was locked on Serene. He was breathing hard, as if he'd been running. He was fighting the instinct, the magic, the law that was now screaming in his blood. The law that demanded he claim. Serene saw the fight. She saw the predator's instinct warring with the man's shock. She turned and ran. Her legs punched through the deep snow, clumsy, desperate. She ran for the trees, for the forest that was her only home. She heard no pursuit. She glanced back. Magnus was still standing there watching her, his hand clenched at his side. He let her run. She plunged into the ironwoods, branches whipping her face. She was 20 yards in, her lungs burning, when she hit a wall. It wasn't a wall of trees. It was him. He hadn't run. He had moved. A blur of shadow and speed, he was simply there in front of her, his path intercepting hers. She cried out, a small choked sound, and fell back. He caught her. His arms closed around her, pulling her against his bare chest. The heat of him was a furnace. She was tiny against his sheer size, her face pressed into the hard muscle of his shoulder. She could feel his heart hammering, a wild, fast rhythm that matched her own. He wasn't hurting her. His grip was firm but not bruising. He was just holding her as if he was drowning, and she was the last solid thing in the world. He buried his face in her hair, breathing her in. The scent of pine and wood smoke, and the sharp, clean terror that was all her own. Why? He rasped, his voice a low growl against her ear. Why did you hide? Serene was trembling, her entire body shaking. She had no answer. She had no voice. She had used it, and in doing so had destroyed herself. My king, Kale was approaching, his hand on his sword. The law is invoked. The binding must be done. We must take her. Magnus's head snapped up. His growl was audible now, a threat that rumbled in his chest, vibrating through Serene. You will be silent, he commanded. He looked back down at Serene. His golden eyes were clearer now, the man pulling back control from the wolf. But they were filled with a terrible, bleak sorrow. They will all know, he said, his voice soft. Your voice. It was not just a sound. It was a bell. Every shifter in my guard heard it. They felt it. The law. Serene squeezed her eyes shut. No, no, I cannot let you go, he said. It was not a threat. It was a statement of fact, as painful for him as it was for her. It has been 8 years. 8 years you stole from me. He was not talking about her. He was talking about her voice. He scooped her up. Serene had no strength to fight. He carried her one-armed as if she weighed nothing. He walked back into the clearing, past his men, who now knelt, their heads bowed. They were not kneeling for him. They were kneeling for her. For the one whose voice had answered the king's soul, she was no longer Serene. She was the Ancora, the fated. He carried her into the great hall past the stunned villagers who had gathered at the door. He didn't take her to the cells. He didn't take her to his own chambers. He took her to the small private room the headman had set aside for his maps. He set her down on a fur-covered bench by a cold hearth. I will not harm you, he said, his voice rough. He was standing in the doorway, blocking the only exit. I swear on my crown, I will not harm you. Serene wrapped her arms around herself, staring at him. But you cannot leave, he continued. You are mine, and I, he finished, his voice breaking on the word, am yours. He looked, in that moment, as trapped as she was. He was a king, an alpha, a being of immense power. But his eyes were the eyes of a man who had just been shackled. The law was absolute. Her voice had been the key, and it had just locked them both in the same cage. The room was small, but not a prison. It was a storeroom, filled with rolled maps and sacks of dried herbs that smelled of lavender and thyme. Magnus left her there, but the door was not locked. It didn't need to be. Cale stood outside. He was not a guard. He was a wall. His pale, angry eyes met hers from the hallway. He was furious, not at her, but at the situation. His king, the great Alpha King, bound to this. Silent, scruffy nothing. Magnus returned. He was wearing a tunic and cloak now, his hair damp. He carried a wooden tray. On it was bread, cheese, and a steaming mug of herb tea. He placed it on the small table. Serene stared at it, unmoving. Eat, he commanded. It was the Alpha voice, low and compelling. Her body wanted to obey, but her will was her own. She turned her head, staring at the wall. She heard him sigh. A low, frustrated sound. He sat on the bench opposite her. The small room was suddenly tiny, dominated by his presence. I do not know your name, he said. Serene remained silent. Please, he said. The word sounded foreign on his tongue. This is not how I... He ran a hand through his hair. The law is ancient. When the Alpha of the first blood hears his true song, the bond is sealed. It is a completion, a strengthening of the line. It is a fate. Serene finally looked at him. Her eyes were cold. She wanted no part of his fate. You think I am a monster, he stated. She didn't deny it. I have been king since I was 16, he said, his voice quiet, almost conversational. He was just talking as if she were a person. I have ruled this frozen wasteland. I have fought the ice clans. I have held the pacts. And I have listened, he leaned forward. Every day, listening for a voice that would settle the beast in my blood. Most alphas never find theirs. They mate for power, for alliance. But my line is different. The law is hungry. Without the bond it consumes. My father, it drove him mad. He looked at his hands. I searched for you. I held councils. I traveled to every corner of the 6 clans. I listened to thousands of voices. And I found nothing, just noise. He looked up, his golden eyes pinning her. And you were here, hiding, living in silence, while I was coming apart. Serene felt a flicker of something. Not pity, understanding he was cursed. That was the sorrow she'd seen in his eyes. He wasn't just a king. He was a prisoner of his own blood. Why? He asked again, his voice gentle now. What did you fear so much that you would rather be a ghost? She thought of Anya, of her hollow eyes. She looked at Cale standing in the doorway. She looked at Magnus, a man who could become a wolf, a king who could take what he wanted. She gave him her answer. She met his gaze, and her own was filled with a cold, clear you. He understood. He recoiled as if she had struck him. You feared me, the claiming. He stood, his frustration radiating from him. It is not like that. Not for us. The true bond is not a violation. It is a recognition. It looks the same from the outside. Cale's voice was dry from the hallway. She is right to be afraid, my king. Kyle, leave us, Magnus snarled. You know I cannot. The Ancora must be guarded. Guard the hall, not the door. Kyle hesitated, then bowed stiffly and moved away. They were alone. Magnus paced the small room. The law demands we return to the capital. The ritual must be performed before the full moon. Serene's head snapped up. The full moon was in 3 days. They will bind us, he said, his voice flat. In the old way. With blood and iron and vows I do not want to speak. He stopped, looking at her. And you will be my queen. He said it like a death sentence. Is that what you want? He asked, his voice raw. To be a queen in a cage, bound to a man you fear? Serene stared at him. What was this? He was the king, he was the wolf. Why was he asking? You have a voice, he said, stepping close. He knelt in front of her so his eyes were level with hers. It was a gesture of supplication, a king on his knees. I heard it. It was the strongest thing I have ever felt. He reached out, not to touch her, but to the tray. He picked up the mug of tea. Please, Serene. She froze. He knew her name. The villagers, he said softly. They mourned you when you lost your voice. They call you Silent Serene. They told me your story. The girl who loved the forest. The daughter of the woodcarver. He knew. He knew her. And he had still knelt. He held out the mug. I will not force you. The law forces me, but I will not. I will not drag a slave to my throne. I will find another way. He was offering her a choice, or the illusion of one. Slowly, her hands shaking, Serene reached out. Her fingers brushed his. His skin was warm, his hand calloused and strong. She took the mug. The warmth seeped into her frozen hands. He stayed there, kneeling at her feet, a king trapped by her voice, waiting for her to make a sound, and Serene, for the first time in 8 years, didn't know what to do. He was not the monster she had imagined. He was something far more dangerous. He was a man, and he was still waiting for an answer she didn't have. They were trapped. The village was stirring, restless. The warriors were packing, but the energy was different. It was no longer a military occupation. It was a religious procession. They were guarding something holy. They were guarding her. Serene drank the tea. It was warm and sweet. Magnus watched her, his expression unreadable. We ride at dusk, he said, rising. The paths will be clearer. He paused at the door. You will ride with me. It is the only way I can protect you. He meant protect her from his own men, from the law. He left her, and Kale's shadow fell across the doorway again. Serene sat, the warm mug in her hands. She was a prize, a trophy, a key. She was no longer a person. Her silence had been her shield, but her voice was her damnation. She had to escape. She waited. Hours passed. The hall became quiet. The warriors were resting before their journey. Kyle was still there, but his posture was relaxed. She looked around the room. The maps, the herbs. There was a small high window, shuttered but not barred. She stood, her movements slow. She walked to the table as if to set down her mug. Kyle watched. She tripped. She fell against the table, sending the maps scattering, and a large sack of dried lavender tumbling to the floor. A cloud of purple dust filled the air. Kyle swore, his eyes watering, his hand flying to his nose. The scent was overwhelming, pungent. In that instant of distraction, Serene moved. She grabbed a heavy rolled map and threw it at Kyle's face. He batted it away, but she was already moving. She darted past him into the main hall. It was empty, save for a few sleeping warriors. The main door was open, the snow bright outside. She ran. She was 10 feet from the door when he hit her. Not Magnus. Kyle. He tackled her from the side, his weight crashing her to the stone floor. Her head cracked against the ground. You little witch! He roared, drawing his knife. I knew you were trouble. He raised the knife. Kale! Magnus's voice was not a voice. It was a physical force. It struck Kyle like a blow, making him freeze. Magnus was on the dais, his fury a palpable, suffocating wave. He moved, a black blur. He seized Kale by the throat, lifting him clear off the ground, and slammed him against a wooden pillar. The hall shook. You will not touch her, Magnus snarled, his voice a low, terrifying guttural. His eyes were pure gold. The wolf was in control. He threw Kale across the room. The general crashed into a table and lay still. Magnus turned. He was breathing heavily, his hands clenched into claws. He stalked towards Serene, who was still on the floor, her head spinning. He was the monster. He was the beast she had always feared. She whimpered. A small, terrified sound. The sound broke through his rage. He stopped. His claws receded. The gold in his eyes softened, pulling back to reveal the man. He looked at her, then at his own shaking hands. He looked horrified. I did not, he stammered. He took a step back. This is the law. It makes me... He turned and strode from the hall. He walked out into the snow, into the gathering dusk. His shoulders rigid. Serene was left alone, gasping on the floor, the metallic scent of his rage still in the air. She didn't run again. Where could she go? Dusk fell. A warrior she didn't know, younger, with kind eyes, brought her a heavy fur cloak. He would not meet her gaze. He bowed and left. She put it on. It smelled faintly of Magnus, pine and cold iron. She walked outside. The village was dark. The horses were ready, their breath pluming. The warriors were mounted, torches flaming, casting wild shadows. Magnus was waiting, his massive black horse shifting. He was separate from his men. He looked at her, his face a mask in the torchlight. He didn't speak. He just offered his hand. She was trapped. She took it. He swung her up, seating her in front of him on the wide saddle. It was a possessive public gesture. She is mine. She was pressed against his chest. His arm was a steel bar around her waist. She could feel the steady, slow beat of his heart. It was not the heart of a raging beast. It was the heart of a weary man. Hold on, he said, his voice quiet for her ears only. He spurred his horse, and they moved, a silent, dark procession, leaving the village, the snow, and her entire life behind. They rode for hours. The moon rose sharp and white. The only sound was the muffled thud of hooves on the snow-packed trail. Serene was rigid, her body aching from the cold, from the tension. She must have drifted, lulled by the rhythm, because she woke with a start. She was gasping, her heart pounding. The nightmare. It was always the same. Anya's hollow eyes, the sound of her scream, the laughter of the Fell clan. Magnus had stopped the horse. The entire procession had stopped. What is it? He asked, his voice low, his arm tightening. She was shaking. She couldn't speak. She was back in her silent fortress. You're safe, he said. He sounded uncertain. You are cold. He shifted, pulling his own massive fur cloak from his shoulders and wrapping it around her, cocooning her against his body. She was completely enveloped by him, his scent, his warmth. It was a cage of heat in the frozen night. I do not wish this for you, he whispered. His voice was raw, his breath hot against her hair. To be bound to a beast, to a crown you never asked for, she stilled. That was it. The crack in his armor. He was not just a king. He was not just a wolf. He was a man who hated the law as much as she did. She felt something warm and wet on her hand. She looked down. A drop of blood, his blood. She looked at his hand, the one that held the reins. His knuckles were split and bleeding. From when he had hit Kale? No. From when he had punched the stone pillar after. He was not just fighting for control. He was hurting. Without thinking, she lifted her free hand, the one not trapped by his arm. She slowly, hesitantly touched his. Her small gloved fingers brushed against his bleeding knuckles. He flinched, his breath hitching. But he didn't pull away. She left her hand there. A tiny, silent gesture. I see you. He let out a long, shuddering breath. He closed his eyes just for a moment. When he opened them, the gold was soft like firelight. We do not go to the capital, he said, his voice firm. Kyle, who had been riding behind them, sullen and silent, pushed his horse forward. My king, the law. The ritual... The law demands a bond, Magnus cut him off, his voice ringing with new authority. It does not say where. It does not say how. He turned his horse, leaving the main trail, heading into the deep, untracked woods. Where are we going? Kyle demanded. To the sanctuary, Magnus said. To the only place older than the law. He spurred his horse into the trees, his arm holding Serene tight, not as a prisoner, but as an anchor. And she, for the first time, did not pull away. She was riding into the unknown, with a wolf who was just as lost as she was. The deep woods were a different world. The trees were ancient, their branches so thick with snow they formed a canopy, a cathedral of white and shadow. The moonlight was thin here, filtering down in slivers. Magnus moved his horse through the trees with an unnatural, silent grace. His men followed, their torches now extinguished, their presence a whisper. Serene was pressed against his chest. The warmth had seeped through her layers, a dangerous comfort. She was exhausted, her mind numb. She had run. She had been caught. She had seen his rage, and she had seen his pain. The monster was complicated. She still had her voice. She had screamed, "No, Edders," but that was instinct. That was an animal's cry. She hadn't spoken. The box inside her was still locked. She felt something hard against her ribs. Tucked into his tunic, her carved bird, he still had it. He had fought his general. He had become a wolf. He had taken her captive. And the small wooden bird was still pressed against his heart. Why? It was a piece of her. A piece of the real her. The one before the silence. The one he couldn't claim. He was the king. He could take what he wanted. He had taken her. But he had kept the bird. It was a contradiction, and it bothered her more than his anger. They rode for what felt like half the night. The trees thinned, and they entered a valley she had never seen. It was sheltered, the air warmer. A faint steam rose from the ground. At the center of the valley was a ring of black volcanic stones, ancient and covered in glowing runes. A hot spring bubbled in the center, its steam wreathing the stones in mist. This was the sanctuary. "Halt," Magnus commanded. His men stopped at the edge of the valley. "Kyle, guard the perimeter." "No one enters." "My king," Kyle said, his voice tight. "This place—" "The old magic is not safe." "It is safer than the capital," Magnus replied. He dismounted, and for a moment, Serene thought he would leave her. But he reached up. "Come." She slid down into his arms. He didn't let her go immediately. He held her, his gaze searching her face in the moonlight. "I will not let them bind you, Serene. But the law, it is still in my blood. It demands an answer." He led her into the ring of stones. The air was warm, the ground beneath her boots soft. The runes on the stones seemed to pulse with a faint silvery light, in time with her heartbeat. He stood before the largest stone, a flat altar-like block near the spring. "This is where the first Alpha made the pact with the mountain," he said, his voice low, "where the Lex Prima was forged. His mate, she died. He tried to bind her soul to his, to force the mountain to give her back." Serene looked at him. "It failed," Magnus said. "The law was a scar, a punishment. It was never about love. It was about possession, about a wolf who could not let go." He turned to her. "That is the law I am bound by. The law of a grieving, selfish man. And your voice, it is the key. It is the only thing that can satisfy it." He looked utterly broken. "If I defy it, if I do not bond with you, it will break me. My wolf, myself. It will shatter. I will become what my father became. A beast." Here it was. The trap. He was cursed. If he claimed her, she was a slave. If he didn't, he was damned. Serene stared at him, at this powerful king laid bare. He was offering her the truth. It was a terrible, ugly truth. She had been silent for 8 years to protect herself, to remain free. But her silence now, her silence was a condemnation. It would doom him. She looked at his face, at the weariness in his golden eyes, at the dried blood on his knuckles. She thought of him kneeling, offering her tea. She thought of him wrapping her in his cloak, his voice raw with regret. "I do not wish this for you." He was not the monster from her nightmares. He was a man in a different cage. He was waiting. He expected nothing. He was a king, and he was completely at her mercy. Her hand of its own accord went to his chest, to the lump in his tunic. She pressed her fingers against it. The bird. He looked down at her hand, then up at her face. Serene opened her mouth. Her throat was tight, rusty. She hadn't formed a word, a chosen word, in almost a decade. She swallowed. She forced the air up, past the fear, past the vow, Magnus. It was a whisper, a scratch. A broken thing, but it was his name. He froze. His breath hitched. His eyes, his golden wolfish eyes, widened. He had heard her voice in rage. But this was the first time she had spoken to him. It hit him harder than her scream. It was not the Lex Prima. It was not magic. It was a choice. He reached up, his hand trembling, and covered hers, pressing her hand against his heart, against the small, hidden bird. "Serene," he breathed, and his voice was not a king's, it was just a man's. A single tear tracked down his cheek, glowing in the moonlight. He had been seen. She had broken her silence, not to save herself, but to answer him. But behind them, at the edge of the clearing, Kale watched, and his face was dark. The king was choosing a mute girl over his crown, over the law, and that to him was a betrayal. The power in the valley shifted. The runes on the stones brightened. their silver light warming to a soft gold. They were responding not to the law but to her choice. Magnus was still frozen, his hand over hers, his heart pounding a desperate rhythm against her palm. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a raw, desperate hope. You spoke," he whispered. Serene nodded, her throat aching. It felt strange to make a sound, but it also felt right. "The law," he said, pulling himself back. It is still there. It's quieter, but it's waiting. It needs an answer." He looked at the altar stone. "The ritual of the capital. It is blood and iron. It binds your will to mine. It makes you a property of the crown." He shook his head, his gaze fierce. "I will not do that. Then you will be broken." Kyle's voice came from the shadows. He stepped into the ring, his hand on his sword. "You will forsake your people, yourself, for her." "She is my Ancora," Magnus said, his voice low and dangerous. He stepped in front of Serene, shielding her. "She is a mute who lied." Kyle spat. "She is a witch who has charmed you. The law is clear. You must claim her, or you must set her aside. If you set her aside, the law will take its due. You will be an unking, a beast. The packs will tear each other apart." "Then I will be a beast," Magnus said, his voice flat. "No," Serene said. The word was stronger this time, clearer. It cut through the night. Both men stared at her. Serene stepped out from behind Magnus. She looked at Kale, this man who saw only law, not justice. Then she looked at Magnus, this man who would sacrifice himself for her freedom. She had spent 8 years running from a fate she feared. But Magnus had just shown her a fate she feared more, a good man's destruction. "You are not a beast," she said to Magnus. Her voice was husky, but it was hers. She walked to the altar stone, the one he had called a monument to a selfish man. She placed her hand on it. The stone was warm, thrumming with energy. "The law is old," she said, her voice growing stronger. "It is from a time of grief." She looked at Magnus. "It is not your law. Serene, what are you doing?" he said, moving toward her. "The law demands a bond," she said, facing him. "It demands a true song. It heard my rage. Now, let it hear my choice." She stood tall. She, who had been a shadow, was now the brightest thing in the valley. The moonlight seemed to pour into her. "I am Serene, daughter of the Ironwood," she said, her voice ringing. I was not silent from damage. I was silent from defiance. I would not be claimed. Kyle watched, his face a mask of disbelief. "And I will not be claimed," she said. She looked at Magnus. "But I will choose." Magnus's breath caught. "You offer me freedom," she said, her voice softening. "You offer to renounce your crown, yourself, for me. A ghost, a stranger." She stepped toward him. "A king who would do that. He is not a man I fear. He is a man I could see." She reached up, not to his chest, but to his cheek. She cupped his face, her hand small against his rough skin. "I will not be your slave, Magnus, and you will not be a beast." "What? What other way is there?" he whispered. "A new vow," she said. "Not of possession. Of partnership." She turned, her hand still on his face, and looked at the glowing stones. "Hear me, old magic. Hear me, mountain. The Lex Prima is broken. It was born of grief, and it ends with choice." She turned back to Magnus. "I, Serene, do not give you my voice. I share it. I will not be your queen. I will be your Ancora, your equal. I will stand with you, not behind you. This I choose." "Serene," he breathed, his eyes shining. He covered her hand with his own. "I, Magnus, Alpha of the First Blood, accept your choice. I will not claim you. I honor you. I will be your shield, not your cage. I will be your king, but I will be your man first. This I choose." As he spoke, a light flared from the altar. It was not the cold silver of the moon. It was a warm golden light, the color of his eyes. It flowed from the stone up Serene's arm and into Magnus's. Magnus cried out, but it was not in pain. He looked at his arm. There was a glowing mark on his skin, a brand. But it was not the jagged, angry rune of the Lex Prima. It was a new mark, a spiral, a circle, a symbol of completion. The pressure in the air vanished. The ancient, hungry waiting was gone. The law was satisfied. No, not satisfied. It was rewritten. Kale fell to his knees, his eyes wide. The magic, it is done," Magnus said. He looked at Serene, his gaze full of an emotion so deep it had no name. He was still the king, he was still the Alpha. But he was no longer cursed. He was whole. He reached into his tunic and pulled out the small carved bird. He pressed it into her hand. "This is yours," he said softly. Serene looked at it, then closed her hand around it. She smiled, her first true smile in 8 years. "No," she said, her voice clear and strong. "It's ours." She took his hand, the one with the new golden mark, and placed the bird in his palm. A new vow. A new bond. He closed his hand around it, and then his other arm went around her waist and he pulled her close. He didn't kiss her. He just rested his forehead against hers, breathing her in. He was a king. She was a ghost. And together, under the ancient watching stones, they had just saved each other. Epilogue. The echo and the howl. They rode back, not as king and captive, but as two riders on a single path. Magnus did not put Serene on his horse. He gave her one of his own, a spirited black mare that seemed to recognize her. Kyle rode beside them, his silence no longer angry but awed. He had witnessed the unmaking of a curse, the birth of a new magic. He had seen his king, who had been willing to lose everything, gain it all back not through power but through vulnerability. When he looked at Serene now, he no longer saw a witch. He saw the Ancora, the one who had healed the king's blood. When they reached the capital, a city of black stone and ice, the rumors had already flown. The warriors had spoken of the Lex Prima being invoked. The court was waiting for a ritual of submission. They were waiting for their new silent queen. They got something else. Magnus walked into the great echoing throne room. The High Council of Alphas assembled. He was not wearing his iron crown. He walked to the center of the room, and Serene was at his side. "Not behind, not veiled. You were summoned to witness a claiming," Magnus announced, his voice ringing with a new clear power that had no trace of the wolf's growl. "You will witness something new." He turned to Serene. She was terrified. The room was full of Alphas, their power a suffocating, predatory wave. She looked at Magnus. He met her gaze, his golden eyes steady. "I am here." She took a breath. And she spoke. She told them her name. She told them of her silence, not as a weakness but as a choice. She told them the Lex Prima was a law of grief and possession. And she told them it was broken. "Your king is not your slave," she said, her voice filling the hall. "He is not a beast bound by a broken pact. He is Magnus and I am Serene. We are not bound by iron, we are bound by choice." There was a silence, so deep it was almost violent, and then one by one, the old Alphas, the ones who had seen Magnus's father descend into madness, knelt. They did not kneel to a king who had claimed his prize. They knelt to the man who had been set free. That night, Serene stood on the high balcony of the citadel, overlooking the frozen city. The full moon was bright, the same moon that should have seen her bound. She felt for the first time in her life not caged, but vast. She heard his footsteps. Magnus came to stand beside her, his presence a familiar warmth. He didn't crowd her. He just stood shoulder to shoulder looking at the moon. "It's quiet," he said. She knew what he meant. The hungry waiting in his blood. "It was gone. What do you hear?" she asked, her voice soft in the cold air. He smiled, a slow, real smile. "Just the wind. And my own heart, and you." He took her hand. His was warm, hers was cold. "Are you afraid?" he asked. Serene thought for a moment. She looked at the city, at the crown she had never asked for, at the man beside her. "No," she said. "I've been afraid for 8 years. I'm tired of it." He lifted her hand, not to his lips, but to his cheek. He held it there, his eyes closing. "I will never be your cage, Serene." "I know," she said. "Neither of us will be." Far below, from the dark line of the ironwood forest, a lone wolf howled. It was not a sound of hunger or of law. It was a sound of freedom. Magnus listened. Then he raised his head, and a matching howl tore from his own throat. It was not the call of a beast, but the call of a man, clear and strong and whole. It echoed across the snow, a new song for a new age. Serene listened to his call, and she did not hear a monster. She heard her name. This was not a story of a silent girl claimed by a king. It was the story of a woman with a voice strong enough to shatter a curse, and a king with a heart strong enough to let her. Serene's 8 years of silence were not an absence, but a crucible, forging a will that could rewrite fate. Magnus was not a monster, but a man trapped by his own legacy. Theirs was not a bond of law, but a covenant of choice. In the frozen heart of winter, under the gaze of a tyrant moon, they found that true love is not about possession, but liberation. The wolf was not tamed and the ghost was not captured. They were simply finally free.